Hello. I recently came across an article in The Atlantic, How to Persuade Americans to Give Up Their Guns. The URL says responsible gun ownership is a lie, but I guess someone over there realized that such a heading was a bit too ridiculous. This article galvanized me into wanting to share a few thoughts on the philosophy behind gun ownership and on American freedom more generally. The main argument of the article was that statistics show that Americans become less safe from having guns in their homes, not more safe. But this is, of course, only an average finding. The problem is that some people using guns irresponsibly drags down the average safety of gun ownership, but this does not mean that there are not many gun owners who practice responsible gun ownership and whose lives do in fact become safer thereby. That is, a valid descriptor for a subset of the category gun owners is applied to the entire category, an error that people commonly make, and that the article makes because it argues in conclusion that people in general should not own guns, whereas it really only follows from the premise that irresponsible or negligent people should not own guns. As so often in philosophy, much depends on how you categorize something. But anyway, this is a fairly minor point. Bodily integrity, that is, self-protection and mastery over one's own body, is an important principle in Anglophone political philosophy. Thomas Hobbes, in his magnum opus, writes as follows: "The right of nature is the liberty each man hath to use his own power as he will himself for the preservation of his own nature, that is to say, of his own life, and consequently of doing anything which, in his own judgment and reason, he shall conceive to be the aptest means thereunto. This is an impediment to the power of kings or of governments in general." He also says, "The right men have by nature to protect themselves, when none else can protect them, can by no covenant be relinquished." That is to say that if protection is not forthcoming from the state, and it is impossible for agents of the state to be everywhere at all times, then the citizen has the right to defend himself by any means necessary. But one of the biggest arguments for gun ownership, and which the Atlantic article does not even mention, is not personal safety, but rather that an armed population is a deterrent against government tyranny. Because one rejoinder that one often hears from gun control advocates is that far more people die from shootings in the United States than, for example, in Europe, although some European countries are trying hard to catch up. This rejoinder is, of course, not relevant to the point of resisting government tyranny, but if we compare national gun deaths, it might behoove us to also consider those European deaths that were caused by the fact that European peoples were so often unable to resist tyranny. The tyrannies that often cropped up in Europe caused wars that led to enormous numbers of deaths, whereas the fact that the American public is armed is one of the reasons why we haven't had such tyrannies here. And so if one wants to view as much of the picture as possible, then taking such European deaths into account, I think, may well be relevant when discussing national gun deaths. Although it's impossible, of course, to know that there would have been a tyranny and a war that would have claimed X number of lives if Americans had not been armed, just as it is impossible to know that there would have been no tyranny and no war if Europeans had been armed, it's still the philosopher's job to see as much of any picture as possible. So what we have here is an important consideration against the point that Europeans have fewer gun deaths. And this leads me to American freedom more generally. The fact that it is easier to legally bear arms in America than any other Western country is one of the biggest arguments for the claim that the United States is the freest country in the world. But the matter goes far beyond that, and contrary to certain freedom indices that exist out there, America is in fact the freest country in the world. In the most recent freedom indices, the United States has dropped down into the teens in the lists of the world's freest countries. But as so often, lists and rankings of this kind are compiled by those of my fellow academics who think that the world can be understood through numbers alone. Whereas in fact, if one genuinely wants to understand a culture or a society, one must be steeped in it. One must read countless books, and one must befriend and live among its people, almost to the point of being one of them. Now, by a happy coincidence, I myself have done precisely that in many countries around the world, and on many continents, so I have much to say. Comparative freedom is a big topic, of course, but I'll at least scratch the surface by saying the following. The reason why North European countries such as Sweden and Germany score higher than the United States on press freedom, for example, is that everybody in those places basically think the same. There is so little antagonism between the government on the one hand and the press and private citizens on the other that very little conflict arises. What passes for polite conversation and acceptable opinion is so much more limited in those countries than it is here in the United States, and so there is consequently much less room for conflict. So in many European countries, from Norway to Italy, one doesn't even notice the limitation on freedom because so many people think the same thing about everything. This causes the illusion that those countries are freer and that their governments are more tolerant of the press and of private citizens than is the case here in the United States. But I can assure you that if the Scandinavian or German press outlets and their private citizens were even only half as loud as people are here in the United States, and represented even only half as many diverging opinions as are common here, we would soon find that their governments are far more antagonistic than they otherwise seem. And an indication of this is, of course, that in much of Europe, citizens are fined and sometimes even arrested for speech, which is still impossible in America. Press freedom in, for example, Sweden is always praised because there is so little conflict between the press and the state. This is then interpreted by culturally ignorant people as tolerance on part of the state. But the real reason is that everyone, the state and the press, have the same or at least similar opinions on so many issues. And indeed nowadays we see a sign of the fact that in the case of real antagonism, European governments are actually far more tyrannical than the American one is. The German government, for instance, is completely ignoring its own constitution and forbidding citizens to even go for walks in public because of COVID. Germany has a nominally federal system, as we do here, but all the state governors, the so-called Ministerpräsidenten, all agree with each other in cracking down on freedom, and so there is much less antagonism. Freedom and harmony to the untrained eye therefore appear to be the norm, although there are of course also some anti-government demonstrations in spite of the fact that the German government has banned protest. In contrast, the reason we find so much antagonism here in the United States between various entities is because we don't agree with each other, and because the Overton window is much, much broader here than it is elsewhere. This makes us score lower on freedom indices, even though it is in fact a proof of the freedom of thought and of the intellectual diversity that still exists, thank goodness, here in the United States. There are considerable differences in freedom among various American states, of course, especially now in times of COVID, but America is the only country in the Western world that does not deny its citizens the right to self-defense, a right that was fully recognized even by a monarchist like Hobbes, and where the Overton window, and therefore spirited debate, is the broadest. So, if you are an American who is afraid to speak his mind, remember how lucky you are to live in America, and please speak up. I'll also make the quick point here that one of the reasons why the accepted range of debate is much narrower in Europe than in the United States is that European countries have already ceased to be great historical powers. The social pathology of oikophobia and self-effacement has already been victorious there, whereas here in the United States the struggle is still ongoing, because we are, in this respect, still at an earlier historical stage than Europe is. This is all explained, to give a self-serving shout-out, in my book Western Self-Contempt, which is coming out in May. Links are in the description below. Thank you very much.